Picture this. You are standing in the marble atrium of a senator's villa in Rome, late in the 1st century BCE. The air is perfumed with crushed rose petals, their fragrance already souring under the heat of oil lamps. Slaves scurry silently across the mosaic floors, setting out silver goblets filled not with wine, but with an amber liquid laced with strange resins imported from the East. The murmur of Latin voices echoes beneath painted ceilings, punctuated by the soft plucking of a lyre. To an outsider, this gathering might appear to be another evening of Roman banqueting, the celebrated convivium of the ruling elite. But this is not a dinner party. You are about to step into the hidden world of the Senate's darkest assemblies' orgies, not of love or pleasure, but of power, humiliation, and ritualized desecration. Before diving into these forgotten stories of cruelty and depravity, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It amazes me how these stories connect us across time and space, bound together by a curiosity for the shadows of the past. The Roman world was built on spectacle, gladiators dying in the sand, criminals nailed to crosses, generals parading chained captives through the streets. But what took place behind closed doors among the Senate's inner circle was far more disturbing, because it revealed not the public theatre of power, but its private engine. Roman chroniclers like Tacitus and Suetonius, though writing carefully to avoid open scandal, left fragments of testimony that speak of nights where Rome's most powerful men gathered not to govern, but to destroy. These were orgies in the truest sense of the word, rituals of sacred violation, modelled on the Bacchic rites that the Republic had once tried to suppress. In 186 BCE, the Senate outlawed the Bacchanalia, fearing its secret nocturnal ceremonies where men and women alike were bound, intoxicated, and forced into sexual frenzy. The official reason given was the threat of conspiracy against the state. But in truth, what terrified the Senate was that ordinary people had discovered the same dark mechanism of power that senators themselves would later exploit in private. The transformation of sex into domination, and domination into a form of sacrifice. Imagine descending into one of these chambers. The torches sputter, casting shadows that crawl like insects across marble walls. At the center of the room stands a dining couch, but it is not for reclining in leisure. Bodies are forced onto it, stripped, bound at wrists and ankles with cords dyed crimson. A senator, his face glistening with oil, raises a cup to Jupiter and pours wine over the victim's mouth until they choke. This act, obscene yet carefully choreographed, blurs the line between libation and drowning. The gathered elite laugh, their laughter dry and cruel, because the suffering body before them is no longer human in their eyes. It is an offering, a vessel onto which they can inscribe their own authority. Juvenal, the Roman satirist, sneers in one of his texts about noblemen who turn their halls into temples of filth, where matrons become whores and boys are slaughtered on couches instead of in the arena. His words, written with venom, are not mere exaggeration. Archaeological traces, the inscriptions scratched onto the walls of suburban villas, depict figures bound and penetrated, sometimes accompanied by fragments of invocations to Venus Libitina, a fusion of the goddess of love and the goddess of death. These orgies were not simple indulgence, they were rituals of inversion, where purity became filth, where the soul was crushed beneath the body. Anthropologists would later call this the realm of the profane masquerading as the sacred. In Roman logic, to humiliate was to dominate, and to dominate was to feed the social machine that demanded constant proof of superiority. The senators did not simply crave pleasure, they craved evidence that their power was limitless, that they could desecrate bodies as easily as they desecrated provinces, that they could turn human flesh into a banquet as casually as they turned conquered cities into ashes. The sounds of these gatherings were not the sighs of intimacy but the shrieks of violation. Witnesses describe groans muffled by gags, the slap of flesh, the laughter of men drunk not on wine but on cruelty. The floors, mosaics once depicting mythological hunts, became slick with blood and semen, substances regarded by Romans as the twin essences of life. To mingle them upon the floor was no accident, it was a parody of sacrifice, a profane libation meant to bind participants together through shared guilt. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, mentions with disgust that certain nobles delighted in mingling seed with the gore of the slaughtered, calling it the true banquet of Saturn. This is not metaphor. Saturn, the god who devoured his own children, was invoked as patron of excess and inversion. In his name, senators acted as gods of their own miniature universes, consuming and destroying, assuring themselves that the Republic, or later the Empire, was sustained by their willingness to obliterate boundaries. What is most terrifying is that these acts were not hidden from all eyes. Slaves watched, forced to participate, their silence ensured by the knowledge that their tongues could be cut out for speaking. Some were killed afterward, their bodies discarded in latrines. To the senators, these deaths were irrelevant, mere offerings to Dispater, lord of the underworld. The body and soul were reduced to currency, a debt repaid in flesh for the privilege of sitting among Rome's rulers. In these chambers, one truth became clear. In Rome, power was not simply debated in the Senate or displayed in the Forum. It was etched into the very bodies of the vulnerable, and the senators, draped in purple, proved their supremacy not only through laws and legions, but through the horror of ritualized degradation. The deeper you move into this world, the more you realize that these orgies were not random nights of indulgence, but carefully constructed theaters of power. They had a script, an order of events, and even a theology that justified the horrors committed within those walls. To the Romans, the body was both sacred vessel and expendable resource. It was currency in a society built on conquest. To give or to take flesh was to affirm rank, and rank was the true religion of the Senate. Suetonius, in his Lives of the Caesars, could barely conceal his revulsion when describing how emperors such as Tiberius and Caligula adapted senatorial excess to imperial scale. Tiberius, he records, kept boys and girls trained to crawl between his thighs, calling them little fishes. Caligula, more brazen, demanded senators surrender their wives and daughters to his chambers, sometimes watching as their humiliation unfolded before their father's eyes. These were not aberrations. They were extensions of the same rituals the Senate had long practiced in private. The Senate did not simply legislate power, it performed it in flesh, blood, and violation. The anthropology of these acts reveals a terrifying symmetry. In ordinary Roman religion, sacrifice was the way to communicate with the gods. A spotless animal, bled on an altar, its entrails read for omens. In the Senate's hidden banquets, the human body replaced the lamb or the ox. Purity and filth collapsed into one another. A virgin body, prized for its symbolic cleanliness, could be torn and bloodied as a mock offering to Venus Libitina. Conversely, the body of a prostitute, regarded as polluted, could be lifted up and enthroned, fed grapes and wine, treated as a parody goddess before being cast down and desecrated. This inversion, turning sacred into profane and profane into sacred, was the essence of their power. Cicero, in his speeches, hints at men of high office who commit deeds in darkness that, if brought into the light, would bring the Republic to ruin. He does not describe the details, but his silence shouts volumes. These men wielded secrecy as a weapon. By binding themselves through shared corruption, they created networks stronger than law or oath. To witness, or to participate, was to be complicit, and complicity was the strongest chain Rome could forge. Picture the moment when the wine jugs run dry and the torches burn low. The laughter has dulled into murmurs. Now begins the second act, darker than the first. A slave, chosen for beauty, is tied upright against a column. Oil is poured over their body, not to soothe, but to glisten, to make every line of the flesh a spectacle. Senators take turns, not in passion, but in duty. Each act witnessed, each humiliation counted. The body becomes a ledger, recording debts of shame and power. When the body collapses, broken or lifeless, it is dragged aside, sometimes mutilated as an afterthought. The silence that follows is not guilt, it is reverence. They believe they have touched something beyond pleasure, something closer to the realm of gods and shades. Tacitus writes bitterly that Rome's ruling class grew fat on vice as much as on tribute. He tells of senators who, after ordering massacres abroad, returned home to seek diversion in games of cruelty upon their own households. One anecdote recounts a senator who forced a group of captives to copulate like animals while the Senate roared in applause. The act was framed as a lesson in dominion. As Rome subjugated provinces, so too must individuals subjugate bodies. The horror is not merely in the acts themselves, but in the logic that sustained them. Rome was a society where the public sacrifice of animals and gladiators was already normalized. The Senate's secret orgies were the hidden twin of that public theater. One affirmed the gods, the other affirmed the senators themselves as gods. The cruelty was deliberate. By desecrating the most intimate boundaries of human existence, they proved there were no boundaries at all. You can almost smell it now, the mingling odors of incense, sweat, semen, blood, and vomit thick in the stale air. The torches sputter. The smoke clings to the vaults. Somewhere a lyre plucks a discordant note, and through it all, the senators sit draped in purple-bordered togas, their rings flashing, their expressions serene. To them, this is not horror, this is order, this is Rome. The sacred and profane meet in grotesque parody of religion. In the Forum, senators swore oaths to the gods, raising their right hands to Jupiter. In the hidden villa, those same hands are used to tear, strike, and defile. The oath becomes an act of violation. The altar becomes a body. The libation becomes the spilling of blood across marble. For the participants, this created a terrible bond. To share in such obscenity was to carry one another's secrets. No man could accuse another without accusing himself. It was a senate of silence, sealed by ritual guilt. Anthropologists call this the economy of pollution. By collectively crossing the boundaries of purity, the group becomes untouchable. Anyone outside could accuse, but they lacked proof. Anyone inside was damned by complicity. And yet, not all voices were silent. In his satires, Juvenal wrote that the Senate's nights are darker than Tartarus, and its banquets more shameful than the rites of Cybele. His disgust is palpable, but his testimony is also evidence. For even as Romans worshipped virtue in marble and bronze, they whispered of vice in shadows. It was an open secret, one that everyone knew but few dared to name. By the time dawn breaks, the villa reeks of extinguished torches and spilled wine. Slaves drag away the bodies, living or dead. It scarcely matters. Senators wash their hands in basins of perfumed water, the same hands that signed decrees and condemned armies to death. They emerge into the Roman morning as if nothing had happened. The city stirs, the Forum fills, and laws are debated in solemn tones. But behind every word lingers the stench of the night, a hidden foundation of blood and degradation on which the Republic, and later the Empire, rested. As the Republic crumbled and emperors rose in its place, the hidden rituals of the Senate did not disappear. They metastasized, becoming weapons in the hands of men who ruled not just the Senate, but the entire Roman world. What had once been private banquets of humiliation became, under imperial authority, theaters of terror where the emperor himself dictated the script. The sacred profane machinery of domination now radiated from a single throne, and the emperors wielded it without restraint. Caligula is remembered as Rome's mad emperor, and yet much of what he did was an amplification of practices senators themselves had already normalized. Suetonius tells us that Caligula invited senators to dine with him, and then forced them to watch while he took their wives to bed, returning them disheveled and bleeding, mocking their husbands for their expressions of shame. This was no private vice. It was humiliation elevated to public theater. To be compelled to watch one's wife desecrated by the emperor was to be stripped of masculine dignity, political authority, and human identity all at once. In Rome, the body of a wife was more than flesh. It was a symbol of lineage and honor. Caligula turned that symbol into a tool of annihilation, showing the Senate that their bloodlines belonged to him. And it did not stop with women. Suetonius whispers of young boys dragged into chambers, of the emperor kissing their necks in public, of families coerced into offering children to his bed. Tacitus, ever the careful moralist, frames these anecdotes as evidence of Rome's descent into chaos, but his disgust also confirms the underlying anthropological truth. Rome's rulers had turned sex into an arena of sacrifice. The body of the child, the wife, the senator himself, all became altars on which imperial power was inscribed. The logic of sacred inversion reached new depths under Nero. His infamous Domus Aurea, the Golden House, was more than a palace. It was a ritual machine. Suetonius describes banquets where ceilings rained perfume and flowers, where couches revolved to reveal hidden performers, where guests dined until they collapsed. Yet beneath the opulence lay horror. Juvenal sneers in one satire that Nero married a boy, castrated and dressed as a bride, calling him Sabina, a grotesque parody of sacred marriage. This boy, Sporus, was paraded before the Senate in bridal attire, kissed in public ceremonies, treated as an empress. It was not a joke, it was domination. By turning a castrated child into a bride, Nero inverted every Roman value: masculinity, fertility, lineage, and marriage itself. The Senate, compelled to watch and applaud, was implicated in the emperor's sacrilege. The anthropological pattern here is unmistakable. In Rome, religion was the glue of society. Marriage was sacred, sacrifice was sacred, lineage was sacred. By desecrating each of these in grotesque parodies, the emperors were not merely indulging perversion, they were reasserting absolute power. If the emperor could remake marriage, then he could remake law. If he could rewrite the boundaries of the body, he could rewrite the boundaries of the state. His excess was a political theology, a living proof that nothing sacred or profane stood above him. Imagine the spectacle in Nero's banquet hall. The torches glow against gilded walls, their flames reflected in polished bronze mirrors. Perfumed smoke coils upward, mingling with the stench of sweat and fear. At the center, a boy in bridal veil trembles, his eyes hollow, his lips painted red. Senators sit stiff, their eyes cast downward, their bodies frozen between horror and complicity. They cannot protest. To protest is to die. So they feast, their mouths chewing roasted peacock as their souls rot in silence. And still, Rome endured. Domitian, ruling after the chaos of Nero and the civil wars, is remembered by Suetonius as a man of paranoia and cruelty. His secret banquets became infamous. He dined at midnight, in halls painted black, lit only by funeral lamps. Each guest found his name engraved on a gravestone placed before his plate. Naked boys painted bone white served the food. The atmosphere was one of staged necromancy, as if each senator present were already a corpse attending his own funeral. The emperor would then initiate acts of sexual violation in this funereal theater, turning death into spectacle, desecration into ritual. The senators laughed nervously, but many left shaking, certain their real death was close at hand. This grotesque staging of death and sex was no accident. It was a deliberate invocation of the sacred-profane paradox. To dine in a hall of tombstones, to watch bodies violated beneath funeral lamps, was to blur the line between life and afterlife, body and ghost, soul and filth. Domitian, by orchestrating these rites, declared himself master of that boundary. He alone decided who would live, who would die, who would be shamed, and who would be spared. Ancient chroniclers recoil from these descriptions, but they preserve enough detail for us to glimpse the horror. Pliny the Younger writes of nights where senators departed pale, as if dragged from the underworld itself. Martial, the satirist, cloaked his disgust in wit, mocking Domitian's feasts as banquets of bones and blood. The language may be poetic, but the fear was real. These were not metaphors, they were events where the most powerful men of the empire were reduced to trembling participants in a theater of humiliation. Anthropologists would say these rituals enacted the collapse of categories. Life and death, male and female, sacred and obscene. In that collapse, the emperor positioned himself as the only stable center, the axis around which the universe turned. To endure his banquet was to confess that all categories could be inverted at his will, and that Rome's elite lived and died at the mercy of his desecrations. The horror is cumulative. You begin to see that these were not isolated stories of deranged rulers. They were the inevitable result of a system where power was measured in the capacity to desecrate. What began as private orgies in senatorial villas metastasized into state rituals staged by emperors, rituals where violation became law and humiliation became governance. The line between the sacred altar and the sexual couch, between the temple and the banquet hall, between the sacrifice of the ox and the sacrifice of a child, all dissolved into a single terrifying continuum. And still, Rome called itself civilized. As these rituals of humiliation spread from the Senate's chambers into the palaces of emperors, they began to poison the very fabric of Roman society. What happened in the marble halls of the elite seeped into the lives of ordinary citizens, not through imitation, but through fear. For when senators and emperors bound themselves together by shared guilt, the rest of the empire was dragged along with them. The cycle of sacred-profane inversion became the hidden engine of Roman power, and its consequences were devastating. Family life in Rome, outwardly celebrated in mosaics and inscriptions, was hollowed out by the corrosion of intimacy. Marriage was supposed to be a sacred bond, a union blessed by the household gods, the Lares and Penates. Yet in practice, wives were often pawns, traded like coins in the political marketplace. A senator might leave a banquet knowing his wife had been violated by the emperor in full view of his peers, yet he would smile the next morning in the forum, pretending nothing had happened. To protest was not only dangerous, it was un-Roman. Silence became the ultimate act of complicity. In that silence, the sacred hearth of the Roman household became a theatre of dread. The children of the elite too were never safe. Juvenal sneers that the child of a senator is born for sacrifice, not for inheritance. It was a cruel truth. Sons might be summoned to a banquet and never return, or worse, return broken, their dignity stripped in ways that no toga could conceal. Daughters were not wives in waiting but bargaining chips, their bodies currencies in the secret economy of corruption. The Roman family, the supposed foundation of the Republic, and later the Empire, was transformed into an altar upon which the state carved its authority. Religion itself became infected. The gods of Rome, Jupiter, Venus, Mars were invoked in temples with solemn ritual, but in the hidden orgies of the elite, their names were profaned, invoked as patrons of desecration. Venus was no longer the goddess of love, but of domination. Mars was no longer the god of honorable war, but of sexual violence. Saturn, the devourer, became the unspoken patron of inversion, presiding over nights where senators devoured the dignity of their peers, as Saturn had devoured his children. To call upon the gods in such rituals was to hollow out their meaning, to turn Rome's divine order into a parody. The anthropological truth here is stark. When a society desecrates its own sacred symbols, it destroys the very framework that gives it meaning. Ordinary Romans felt the weight of this desecration in more visible ways. Grain shortages, corruption, and endless wars were justified as divine necessity, while the emperors and senators feasted on sacrilege. Citizens who once crowded the temples for festivals began to whisper of omens, comets blazing, earthquakes shaking, plagues spreading. For them, the gods were angry, and rightly so. They may not have known the details of the Senate's orgies, but they sensed the corruption that festered at the heart of power. The historian Tacitus writes that, "Never was Rome more prosperous in appearance, nor more rotten in its soul." His words strike like a blade, cutting through the illusion of marble and law to reveal the stench beneath. Even the act of public sacrifice was distorted by the private rituals of desecration. When an ox was slaughtered in the forum, when its entrails were examined for omens, the people could not help but think of the whispered tales that in the emperor's palace, human bodies were treated the same way. The sacrifice of animals was supposed to uphold the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, but the elite had already mocked that peace, turning it into a tool for cruelty. The entire structure of Roman religion was undermined by the private theology of violation practiced by its rulers. And what of the Senate itself? Once the guardian of tradition and virtue, it became a theatre of masks. Senators who had participated in unspeakable acts by night spoke solemnly of law and justice by day. Their speeches rang hollow, their votes predetermined by fear and guilt. Cicero once wrote that the Senate was the soul of Rome, but by the 1st century CE, that soul was corrupted, split between the marble dignity of the forum and the blood-slick couches of the banquet hall. The institution that had once bound Rome together became the very vessel of its disintegration. Anthropologists speak of debt and sacrifice as twin pillars of archaic societies. In Rome, the Senate transformed sexual violation into a form of debt. To participate was to incur a debt of silence, a debt of complicity that could never be repaid. To refuse was to risk exclusion, exile, or death. The sacrifice was not of animals or conquered enemies alone, but of one's own dignity, one's wife, one's children, one's soul. The Senate's orgies were not entertainment. They were the machinery of political debt, ensuring that no senator could ever stand alone, that all were bound together in a web of shared corruption. Consider the psychological toll. Imagine a senator returning home after such a night. He bathes in perfumed water, scrubbing his skin raw, but he cannot wash away the stain. His wife looks at him with hollow eyes, knowing what has been done. His children shrink from his touch, sensing the corruption. Yet the next morning, he dons the toga and enters the Curia, raising his voice in praise of the emperor, in loyalty to Rome. This is not loyalty, it is survival. The price of survival is silence, and silence corrodes the soul. Over time, this corrosion spread outward. The legions, once the backbone of Roman power, became mercenaries loyal more to paymasters than to Rome itself. Soldiers heard rumors of senators feasting on obscenity while they bled on distant frontiers. Their loyalty faltered. The people, once proud of their republic, once awed by the majesty of empire, began to withdraw into cynicism. Bread and circuses distracted them, but beneath the laughter in the amphitheater there was bitterness. They sensed the rot, even if they could not name its source. The horror of the Senate's orgies was not confined to those rooms. It seeped into every layer of Roman life, corroding family, faith, politics, and military alike. By desecrating the most intimate boundaries of humanity, Rome's elite had desecrated the very foundations of their civilization. The empire still stood, its marble monuments gleaming in the sun, its armies still marching across continents, but beneath that brilliance lay a darkness that grew deeper with every night of ritual violation, every oath broken, every body sacrificed to the hunger of power. Rome appeared eternal, but in truth, it was already rotting from within. Picture the empire at its height. Marble temples gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, aqueducts spanning valleys, legions marching in perfect order. To the outside world, Rome seemed immortal, a city of order and law. But behind the facade, within the villas of senators and the palaces of emperors, the rot festered. What had begun as private inversions of sacred ritual had by the 2nd century become a culture of corruption so entrenched that even Rome's gods seemed powerless against it. The hidden rituals of degradation were no longer aberrations. They were Rome itself, woven into its political DNA. By the time of Commodus, the corruption had reached the amphitheater. The emperor himself descended into the arena, fighting as a gladiator, humiliating the Senate by forcing them to cheer his staged victories. It was no longer enough to desecrate in private. Desecration had become public policy, an imperial performance. The historian Cassius Dio, himself a senator, wrote bitterly that Commodus reduced us all to slaves of his cruelty, mocking us as we cheered for him like children. It was the same pattern we have traced from the Republic's villas to Nero's banquet halls. Sacred institutions turned into obscene theatre, the body, whether of slave, senator, or emperor, transformed into an altar of humiliation. The anthropological theme is unmistakable. In every society, the sacred defines the limits of what cannot be violated. In Rome, the Senate's orgies systematically erased those limits. Family became a market, marriage became parody, sacrifice became desecration. The soul was consumed by the body, and the body itself was consumed by power. In this inversion, Rome hollowed out its own foundations. For once a society declares that nothing is sacred, everything becomes disposable, including itself. The consequences were visible. Faith in Rome's institutions collapsed. The Senate, once the heart of the Republic, became a hollow echo chamber, too complicit in its own corruption to resist emperors. The legions, hearing of their rulers' decadence, sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. The people, numbed by bread and circuses, ceased to believe in the gods or in their rulers. What remained was a shell, monuments without meaning, rituals without faith, laws without justice. The chroniclers of decline, like Ammianus Marcellinus in the 4th century, describe a Rome obsessed with spectacle, drowning in luxury, yet unable to defend itself. He sneers that the nobles counted the days only by their banquets, their wives by their jewels, their sons by their debaucheries. His disgust is not just moral, it is existential. He saw, as we must, that the corrosion of the sacred destroyed Rome's ability to survive. When Goths marched into Italy, when Vandals sacked the city, the empire that once ruled the world collapsed not with a scream of defiance, but with a whimper of decadence. Think of the symbolism. In 410 CE, when Alaric's Visigoths breached Rome's walls, they plundered not just gold and jewels, but the sacred symbols of the empire. Temples were stripped, homes desecrated, bodies left in the streets. It was an external invasion, but the groundwork had been laid centuries earlier inside the marble halls of the Senate. Rome had already desecrated itself. The barbarians only finished the work. Anthropologists remind us that cultures live and die by the boundaries they uphold between sacred and profane. When those boundaries collapse, the society devours itself. The Roman Senate's secret orgies were not entertainment. They were the ritualized erasure of those boundaries. In humiliating wives, children, slaves, and even themselves, senators proclaimed that nothing was untouchable, nothing sacred. And in that proclamation lay Rome's doom. Now, consider the warning. We like to think of ourselves as distant from Rome, more enlightened, more humane. We recoil at the thought of senators laughing as bodies were violated on couches, at emperors forcing men to applaud their grotesque theatre. Yet ask yourself, have we truly escaped the Roman logic of desecration, or merely disguised it? Look at our politics, where humiliation is a currency. Look at our entertainment, where violence and degradation are consumed for pleasure. Look at our institutions, where corruption hides behind ritual. Rome teaches us that once the sacred is profaned for power, there is no easy return. The descent is slow, but relentless. Picture this, a society that laughs while its leaders desecrate truth, that numbs itself with spectacle while the foundations crumble, that treats bodies as commodities and the soul as irrelevant. You are not looking at ancient Rome, you are looking at us, in a mirror held across 2,000 years. Tacitus once wrote that Rome's rulers created a desert and called it peace. We might say they created an orgy and called it civilization. The marble temples, the legions, the laws all were built on a foundation of silence, complicity, and desecration. That silence rotted Rome from within until it collapsed into dust. Before we close, take a moment to let this image settle. The Senate's hidden chambers, floors slick with blood and wine, senators draped in purple laughing as bodies collapse before them. Outside, the people cheer gladiators in the arena, unaware that the same logic of sacrifice that kills men in sand is consuming their rulers in private. And above it all, the empire stretches from Britain to Egypt, seemingly eternal, yet already dead inside. The lesson is simple, but terrifying. No empire falls in a day. It falls in silence, in complicity, in the laughter of men who believe nothing is sacred. Rome's secret orgies were not just nights of depravity. They were omens. They remind us that civilizations rot not from invasion alone, but from the desecration of their own souls. So, as you step back from these shadows of the past, ask yourself, what do we hold sacred, and how long can any society endure once it forgets?